So first of all, a quick background on River Network. Many of you already are familiar with River Network and may already be members, so thank you. But for those of you who don't, River Network, we are a national organization, and we work to empower and unite people and communities to protect and restore rivers and other waters around the country that sustain us. And our work is focused primarily on helping small and medium-sized organizations working at the local level who provide that voice for the needs of specific rivers and their watersheds, and by providing resources and expertise in areas essential to strong organizations, including river champions, advocacy training, and protecting and restoring clean and ample water. Since 1998, we have accomplished our mission by investing in these local efforts and helping to advance impact at broader scales. And we've also, one of the areas we've worked on historically has been developing and delivering trainings for watershed groups around the country on the Clean Water Act and Clean Water Act implementation, including stormwater. And so today's topic, of course, is near and dear to our hearts. But the slide here is just a reminder to all of you that registration for River Rally is open. And this is our great meeting we hold every year. This year it's in Mobile, Alabama in May. We hope you all can join us. It'll be great with tracks on everything from clean and ample water, science for advocates, and many other things. Such a great gathering. And so for those of you who are members already, thank you. And it's also a great time, if you're not, to join or to renew, because members get a great discount to River Rally. You can also, as a member of River Network, you're eligible to apply for a scholarship. And scholarship deadline this year is February 19th. So please consider joining or renewing by then and joining us River Rally. In addition to many of the other member benefits you get by being a River Network member. And thanks so much to all of you who are already River Network members and supporters. So let's talk about today's webinar. We've got a great lineup here to talk about the Stormwater Rule. First of all, we're going to have an overview of the rule by Deborah Clovis of EPA. She's going to be followed by Larry Levine at NRDC to talk about the implications and analysis of the rule. And then we will have a time for Q&A. As I said before, we will stop for any clarifications between the presentations as needed, so definitely use the chat box as you have if you need to. So I will go ahead and introduce both our speakers, and then I will be handing it over to Deborah. So our two speakers today, Deborah Clovis has been an attorney advisor in the Water Permits Division in EPA's Office of Water for over 30 years. Along the way, she's worked primarily in developing regulations and policy in the core National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System program, the pretreatment program, the biosolids program, and water quality-based permitting program. Her latest endeavor has been the Stormwater program, where she's been working on the small MS4 general permit remand rule, which she's going to tell us about today. Next is Larry Levine, who is a senior attorney with NRDC's water program. He works on a variety of issues pertaining to water quality and water efficiency in the Northeast and at the national policy level. His work focuses especially on promoting the use of green infrastructure as a sustainable solution to polluted urban runoff and raw sewage overflows, and on urban water efficiency strategies such as fixture efficiency standards and reducing water loss in drinking water utilities. He was previously a litigation fellow at NRDC and a clinical fellow in environmental law at Georgetown University Law Center and a graduate of Yale Law School and Tulane University. So really pleased, thanks to both of you for joining us today. And with that, I am going to switch over to Deborah's presentation. Oh, not that one. Okay, and so Deborah, the slides are yours, and please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. I'm pleased to be here today, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the general permit, small MS4 general permit remand rule. And what I hope to cover today is just to provide some background to explain why we are doing this regulation at this particular time. And then I will describe the three options that we've put out for public comment and are described in our Federal Register notice. And then, as Catherine said, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. So, to start, back in 1999, EPA promulgated regulations for small MS4s. And when we set up those regulations, we set up the way small MS4s got covered by a general permit a little bit differently than our normal practice under 12228, if you're familiar with that. So the way it was set up is that the permitting authority issues the general permit, and then to be covered under the permit, the small MS4 would send us a notice of intent that lays out the different BMPs that it intends to use to meet the requirements of the permit. And a major requirement of the permit would be to develop, implement, and enforce a stormwater program that covers 6 minimum measures. We were sued on that rule for a number of reasons by a number of different entities. And one of the issues concerned the, just a second, let me get there, concerned that process that we had set up for small MS4s to obtain permit coverage under a general permit. And this is, this is important because about 94% of all small MS4s are covered by a general permit. And what the court looked at was that process, and it found deficiencies in how that was set up, and it remanded our deficiencies back to us to fix. And the concern the court had about the way we set up general permits for small MS4s is that there was no apparent review and approval by the permitting authority of the BMPs that were sent in by the small MS4s. Also, the stormwater management plan, which kind of spells out in more detail how the permittee will meet its requirements, is under the regulations. It just doesn't say a lot about that. It doesn't specifically require that they be submitted to the permitting authority. It doesn't specifically require that the permitting authority do anything with those stormwater program documents when they come in. And the court was troubled by the lack of permitting authority review, and it was also concerned that the NOI seemed more like a permit application than the NOIs we use for most general permits. And under the Clean Water Act, permit applications and permits have to be made available for public review, and permitting authorities have to provide opportunity for comment and to request a public hearing. And none of that is apparent, none of that was happening, or none of that was required by our regulations. So the court also found that the procedures were contrary to the Clean Water Act. After that decision in 2003, EPA put out a memo with interim guidance on how to deal with that court remand, and it included information on publicly making available NOIs retroactively through various different means, and also that the general permit include information about how one would go about requesting a hearing, a public hearing on the NOI. So that memo went out. It kind of was there, and EPA went forward with implementing the Phase 2 program. Recently, meaning in the last 5 years or so, EPA's put a lot of emphasis on improving the quality of small MS4 permits. And we put out a permit improvement guidance in 2010 put out revisions to an earlier memo that addressed how to deal with TMDLs and stormwater permits. And in that revision, we talked about clear, specific, and measurable permit requirements for the first time, I think. Despite what we may have meant all along. That was the first time. And then we really had not done what the court asked us to do back in 2003. And in December 2014, NRDC and the Environmental Defense Center, which were the petitioners, asked the Ninth Circuit to issue a writ of mandamus. And what they asked for was that EPA immediately revise the Phase 2 regulations to comply with the 2003 court order, and then to propose within 6 months and finalize within 6 months after that a rule revising the Phase 2 small MS4 regulations. EPA did realize it had something to do here, and it settled with the petitioners in August. And the primary thing addressed by that settlement were the deadlines for EPA to propose a rule, and that needed to be signed by December 17th, and it was. And then by December 17th, then by November 17th, 2016, have a final rule signed. Now, there was another issue that was remanded by the court, and that had to do with the regulation of stormwater discharges from forest roads, and EPA is also addressing that, but in a separate action. So I'm only going to talk about the small MS4 part of that remand. So one of the first things we did after we realized we had to do something was to find out what states were doing now with respect to providing public notice of NOIs. And states were kind of all over the board. Some adopted specific procedures to deal with the remand. Sometimes it meant having a waiting period after the NOI is submitted for coverage. And then during that waiting period would be the opportunity to submit comments and request a hearing. Some permitting authorities have set up a system to individually review each NOI, and in some cases the stormwater management programs, and incorporate them as enforceable requirements of the permit. And then some permitting authorities have just simply made their permits more robust so that the permit really does contain the requirements that the permitting authority has determined are necessary to meet the regulatory standard of reducing pollutants in discharges to the maximum extent practicable to protect water quality and implement appropriate requirements of the Clean Water Act. And then finally, we found a couple of permitting authorities that actually issued individual permits to each of the small MS4s. And by doing that, they took care of the public notice and the permitting authority review, because that happens with every individual permit. So, we looked at those state examples, and we came up with 3 options. Before I talk about those, I just want to be really clear about what the rule does and does not address. This rule is tailored solely to meet the remand order to fix our regulations concerning the coverage of small MS4s under general permits. And the 2 items really that the court focused on was the need for the permitting authority to establish what constitutes MEP and to establish the other requirements of the permit, and then to provide an opportunity for the public to review and comment on the MEP requirements and to request a public hearing. That's it. We are not changing or proposing to change any of the substantive requirements applicable to small MS4s. We understand that there are some that people have advocated, but there simply is not time. The time frame that we have for doing this rule is extremely short. So we're going to focus on getting done what needs to get done. Just a note to let you know that the proposed rule in the Federal Register notice actually has complete sections in it, but we're really only proposing revisions to select portions of those regulations. And in the docket, if you want to see a red line strikeout version of our existing regulations, that's in the docket at regulations.gov. Okay, so with that, I'll turn to the three options. The first one we call the traditional general permit approach. And this would be the approach where the permitting authority put all the requirements in the permit itself. And then the NOI becomes a means to sign up for coverage. It doesn't actually identify the BMPs that will be followed by a particular small MS4 because the permit should spell all of that out. And then if there are changes to that, the permit usually addresses how changes are made, but if there are changes, then it needs to go through a permit modification process. So we call that the traditional general permit approach, which is something that the court kind of implied would work. And we put in language in describing, in proposing revisions, we propose to change our requirements and direct them to the permitting authority rather than the small MS4. And the permitting authority is directed to issue a permit with clear, specific, and measurable requirements necessary to meet the regulatory standard and implement the 6 minimum control measures. So we went through a number of general permits and found examples that we thought were pretty good examples for establishing clear, specific, and measurable requirements in the permit. We also put out a compendium recently about permit language for implementing TMDLs and post-construction requirements in the small MS4 permit. And under this option, certainly there's going to be a lot more specificity about what exactly is required, but we aren't envisioning that every detail is going to be nailed down in the permit, that the MS4 will still have some flexibility to determine how it's going to meet those permit terms. The second option we call the procedural option, and it is the one that most closely follows what the court suggested in the remand order. And that is we would keep the existing framework. The NOI would have the BMPs that the MS4 wants to implement. But the NOI becomes just, excuse me, I heard a buzz. So the NOI still has all the BMPs, but once that comes in, the permitting authority would have to public notice that NOI. and then it would have to determine that whether or not those BMPs were sufficient to meet the standard. If not, then they would augment those, and the revisions would be made. And then when the final decision was made, after any revisions, after any public comments or hearing, the permitting authority would publish or somehow notice exactly what requirements apply to that particular MS4. And so that process is similar to some others that we have in our existing regulations. It's a lot like modifying a permit, and in fact, the requirements that the permitting authority says are necessary to meet the standard would be enforceable permit conditions. So it is pretty much like a permit modification. It's also similar to how our regulations set up the procedures for developing enforceable requirements of a nutrient management program for CAFOs. And we didn't put out specific regulatory language for option 2, but we explained it in great detail in the preamble, and I think there's enough there for people to comment on. We looked at a couple of states. We could only find 2 states that actually used this 2-step procedural approach. And one was Minnesota, the other was Texas, and we talked to both of those states to kind of understand how they did things and how things worked out for them. Finally, the third choice, the third option is what we call the state choice approach. And this option would give the permitting authority the discretion to use option 1 or option 2 or some hybrid of both of those approaches, depending on, how it wanted to address different requirements or address different categories of small MS4s. The Federal Register was published on January 6th. We have a 75-day comment period that ends March 21st. We need to have the final rule signed by November 16th, 2016, so that's this year in a couple of months. So I hope everybody is having a chance to read the proposed rule and is preparing comments. And throughout the preamble notice, there are requests to comment on specific things, but we, of course, are interested in comments on any aspect of the proposed rule. And for further information, I have my name down there and phone number. And then Greg Shaner, who is the other person who worked on the rule, is out until mid-February, but then after that, you can also contact him. And that is the overview.
That's great. Thank you very much for that overview. We just got a question in, so let's pause here, and maybe both Deborah and Larry want to address this one. But Sin has asked, under option 2, could citizens legally challenge NOIs?
Well, they could comment on the NOI and certainly comment on the merits of the NOI. And what happens after that is the requirements that the permitting authority determines are necessary become a part of the permit. So what they would challenge would be the NOI and any other requirements that are established as permit conditions. So there's not a separate process for appealing an NOI. It all gets integrated into the small MS4 general permit. Okay, great. Thank you. Are there any other clarification questions for Deborah before we hand it over to Larry? We'll also have a chance afterwards. Okay, great. Well, that's a good sign that your presentation was super clear. So thank you so much. Okay, Larry, I've
queued up your presentation, and you're welcome to get started.
Great. Thanks very much, Catherine. So I'm going to first step back a little bit for some broader context, and then drill down into some more detail, and hopefully in between avoid too much redundancy with Deborah's presentation. And if I find any, I will breeze through that part. So just for context, in case there are some folks on the call who are less familiar with what we mean when we say small MS4s, we're talking here about municipalities with a population of under 100,000 people, which are in urbanized areas as defined by the census. And one thing that's really important to note about this is that the 100,000 population is based on a municipality's boundaries, not based on what the population of the metro area or of the entire urbanized area is. So in many, many places, most of the suburbs of a large city will end up being small MS4s. And the category of small MS4 also includes things like state departments of transportation and other publicly owned facilities that they're big enough that they essentially have their own drainage systems. There are 6,700 small MS4s nationwide, and about 44% of the U.S. population actually lives in municipalities with under 100,000 population in urbanized area. Some of those systems, just for precision, some of those systems are going to be combined sewers, but the vast majority of them are separately sewered, separate stormwater sewers, and therefore are regulated as small MS4s. And that's actually a larger percentage of the population living in these small MS4 areas than living in large MS4 areas. So this is a significant rule, notwithstanding the word small in the title. So just to provide some more historical context, the regulation of MS4s and the shortcomings of regulation of MS4s date back several decades into the 70s. In 1977, following litigation by NRDC and others, the federal court held that EPA could not exempt stormwater pollution from the Clean Water Act, that it was in fact a point source discharge if it is being channeled through storm sewers and other sorts of discrete point sources. In 1987, Congress amended the Clean Water Act to set some phased deadlines for issuing permitting regulations for stormwater, since the agency still had not acted by that point. There was first a phase 1 regulation covering large MS4s, and then in 1999, the phase 2 rule was issued. As Deborah mentioned, in 2003, there was the federal court ruling remanding and vacating and remanding it in part. And then last year, the settlement setting the deadline 12 years after that decision, unfortunately, setting that deadline for EPA to actually act on the remand because they had not done so in the interim. Just real quick on the court decision, as Deborah explained it, but I think the key take-home points, I would say, are that EPA and the rule had impermissibly allowed the small MS4s to set their own standards without oversight from the state and federal agencies or from the public. And that's what the court deemed as self-regulatory and therefore impermissible, not consistent with what the Clean Water Act requires for NIPD's permitting. And the court focused in particular on the maximum extent practicable standard that the Clean Water Act Section 402P applies to MS4s, and remanded the rule to EPA to fix this flaw, to make sure that that permits were in fact going to go through the right process, have the determinations made with public input, not in a self-regulatory manner, to make sure that that legal standard from the Act is met in every permit. In the interim, one significant thing that many of you are likely aware of, I'll point out, in 2008, the National Research Council, which is an arm of the National Academy of Sciences, came out with a landmark study on urban stormwater management in the United States. And two of the key conclusions reinforced essentially the theory behind, the legal theory behind the court's ruling. The National Research Council found that in practice that is what in fact was happening. permits that had been issued lacked measurable enforceable requirements. They left a great deal of discretion to the MS4s to set their own standards. In other words, that self-regulation that the court had talked about, and they recommended significant changes to the regulatory program are needed to provide meaningful regulation. And EPA's analysis of how the states are currently handling it also bears this out. One of the supporting documents that went along with the proposed rule from EPA is what they called their economic analysis report. And within that, they analyzed what states are currently doing in order to determine how much additional effort they might need to put in to comply with option 1 or option 2. And according to their analysis there, they were able to identify only 5 states whose general permits include provisions consistent with option 1, is how EPA described it. And I would say actually it's not entirely clear to me whether they meant that those entire permits are consistent with option 1 or that certain parts of them are. If it's the latter, then even those states aren't fully in compliance with option 1 in EPA's view. Identified, as Deborah said, 7 states that don't use a general permit at all for small MS4s, and so they're essentially compliant because they're issuing individual permits, not general permits, and the court ruling pertains specifically to the general permits. And then those 2 states, Texas and Minnesota, that are reviewing and approving individual notices of intent. And so if you do the math there, that means at least 36 states are basically following that self-regulatory approach that the court found unlawful more than a decade ago. And again, as I mentioned, it may be more than that if some of those 5 states in the top bullet point there actually are not fully compliant themselves. So again, underscores the significance of this rule. As Deborah mentioned, in 2004, there was non-binding guidance that EPA issued, as we see from the evidence that did not by itself induce compliance with the act by the states. In 2009, then, was the next attempt by EPA at actual rulemaking. That rulemaking was focused on new rules for runoff from developed land, which is what's deemed post-construction runoff under the regulations. The focus there, as many of you will know, was on green infrastructure approaches, which is consistent with what the National Research Council recommended in terms of handling runoff in a way that replicates the way the natural environment handles it, capturing it on site to avoid pollution running off into the sewers and then into the waterways. It was also expected that that rule would address this small MS4 issue, the remand issue. However, in 2014, EPA abandoned that rulemaking. And that, in turn, is what sparked NRDC, Environmental Defense Center, who were the original petitioners in that old case, to go back to court and seek a court-ordered deadline to ensure that EPA acts on at least the issues that the court had remanded in 2003. We ended up then with a settlement with these deadlines that Deborah mentioned, and I'll just flag that those deadlines are enforceable in court. There was an order entered by the court, not simply an out-of-court settlement. So I know many of you are familiar with and probably were engaged in various ways in that prior rulemaking effort by EPA. So how does this differ, you may be wondering? The key difference is while that rulemaking, well, a couple key differences. While that rulemaking was focused on the post-construction stormwater pollution controls in particular, this rulemaking addresses the full suite of the types of permit limits that may be developed, although it is, as Deborah mentioned, procedural in nature rather than substantive. It also, as opposed to the earlier rulemaking, is focused on small MS4s in particular, whereas the prior rulemaking would have covered all MS4s and potentially areas beyond existing designated MS4s. So a much narrower scope here in most respects, although in one respect, again, this touches on and will have implications for things other than simply post-construction runoff. So Deborah mentioned also the EPA MS4 Permit Improvement Guide. A couple of key things from that. So this idea that Deborah mentioned in the proposed rule of clear, specific, measurable, enforceable permit terms, that comes out of this Permit Improvement Guide, and we're glad to see that concept being picked up in the proposed rule. I'll come back to that again a little bit later. Another thing that the preface to that Permit Improvement Guide highlighted as a second key take-home message from that, and then elaborated in the body of that guide, was, again, picking up on that green infrastructure approach. EPA said in that guide, permits should contain a performance standard based on maintaining or restoring stable hydrology. That's along the lines of this concept of an on-site retention standard to reduce the volume of runoff. So in this rulemaking so far, prior to the proposed rule that was issued in December, there's been some informal public engagement. In the fall, EPA sought input from the environmental community, from the states, and from regulated municipalities. NRDC organized a sign-on letter with which 23 other environmental groups joined, providing some recommendations to EPA as to what we believe they ought to include in the rule. And the only other, I believe, comment letter pre-proposal to EPA was from NACWA, representing the utilities, or many of them. And the comment period, as Deborah said, goes for 2 more months. So how would one assess this proposal? How, at least MIN, NRDC, and others that we've been speaking with, beginning to assess this proposal? I'll offer some preliminary thoughts here and flag some questions that I would encourage all of you to be thinking about as you review the rule and consider developing your own comments or joining with others in comments. So as a starting point, the key objectives that we and other groups set out in that comment letter we sent to EPA last fall, how does the proposed rule measure up in terms of that? So the first overall concept, of course, goes back to the court decision of where the court found there was unlawful self-regulation. So the first objective here has to be ending self-regulation by the small MS4s. We pointed, in fact, back to EPA's Permit Improvement Guide from 2010 and asked them to incorporate that concept of clear and objective permit terms, performance standards, we would hope they would be framed, and making sure that the permit process is done in a transparent way that empowers local groups to advocate. And what we mean by that is the way that the system has worked in most states. These NOIs, these notices of intent, contain the substantive requirements that an MS4 has selected for itself, and there has not been an opportunity for interested citizens and advocacy groups to engage in a decision-making process with the permitting authority to weigh in on what those standards should be. The general permits themselves have been the place where public comment and participation has happened, but because those general permits have been so vague as to defer to the municipalities, the public participation that exists has not been allowed for meaningful engagement by local groups. And one separate point that we noted, and this is an important distinction, we think, is that with respect to permit terms that are getting at water quality-based limits, in other words, things that are not about implementing the maximum extent practicable standard, but that rather are about meeting water quality standards, things such as a TMDL implementation plan, for example. We believe that those may need some particular attention and opportunity for the development of MS4-specific compliance plans, and so we asked EPA to make sure that the rule preserved that opportunity. So how does the rule do against these metrics? on that last point, again, option 3 that EPA invited comment on, that would achieve that last point if it's adopted. And so we believe that it's important to pay some attention to that one and how that's crafted, and recommending that EPA adopt it, and in particular how they frame that. The option 1 is what we endorsed principally in our comment letter, and EPA has indicated in the proposed rule that they're leaning that way as well. And if option 1 is well defined and precisely drafted in the rule language, we believe that it can achieve that objective, those objectives of the clear performance standards, and empowering local groups, because the decision-making process would be centered on the issuance of the general permit itself, with an opportunity for citizens to weigh in, to even to challenge the permits, and the decisions being made by the permitting authority on what the pollution control requirements are. The second thing we said in that comment letter was we urged EPA to address at least one key substantive issue. And as you heard from Deborah, the way they framed this rule, they have circumscribed their proposal to focus on procedural issues only. The reason why we said that it would be appropriate to address a substantive issue is that ultimately what the court was getting at in 2003 was that permits need to ensure that MS4s are required to meet that maximum extent practicable standard, need to ensure that the permits specify what it means, what it would take for the MS4 to actually be implementing that. And so we believe that the clearest way for EPA to ensure that happens would be, in fact, to define in a federal rule what it means to be reducing pollution to maximum extent practicable. And going back to EPA's prior efforts that they did not complete, where the focus was on post-construction standards, we asked EPA to, at a minimum, set a floor defining what MEP means with respect to post-construction, and to do so in a way that focuses on green infrastructure approaches based on an on-site retention standard. EPA did not do that in the proposed rule. I'll come back to that again in a moment. So I'm going to give some more specific thoughts on option 1 and on option 3, and I'm going to basically skip over option 2 because, as I noted, the option 1 is what we and other groups endorsed as the principal approach that we think would best enable us to meet the objectives. Option 2, where it's done through NOIs and an individual review process for each NOI, we believe is likely to be too cumbersome and not provide actually as not be likely to result in as much actual public participation as if advocates at a state level can focus on a central decision about a permit. And we've seen what we generally believe to be the case is that states that allow for some public comment on NOIs, there's much less participation on a single municipality by municipality basis commenting on those NOIs than there has been comment on the general permits themselves. So if we focus the energy on the general permits themselves, we can have more we believe we can have more transparent and more effective decision making. So the rule the proposed rule under option 1 includes that language about that permit terms have to be specific, clear, and measurable. Great concept. How do we make sure this gets effectuated in the rule language so that there's no doubt what the states need to do to implement that? That's something that we're going to be very closely looking at in parsing the language. Is the language of the rule itself strong enough, detailed enough to make sure that intent is effectuated? The preamble, if you can read the small print on the bottom, that first asterisk, I have a quote there from the preamble that elaborates a bit more on what EPA meant by that. Some of that elaboration perhaps might do well to go in the proposed rule itself, and perhaps some other wording as well to be to make sure that the meaning is precise. EPA provided a number of examples of what would meet the test of being specific, clear, and measurable. Deborah mentioned that compendium that accompanies the proposed rule. Folks should be looking at, are those examples adequate? Do we agree that those are good examples to highlight? Are there others that we believe EPA should highlight? And folks who have advocated on MS4 permits in your own watersheds or states can have a wealth of experience to bring to that question and help make sure EPA is holding out the best examples to really elaborate on what is meant by this requirement. And similarly, EPA provides in the proposed rule some examples of the sorts of permit terms that would not meet this test. So for example, they say if a permit basically copies and pastes the language from the minimum control measures in the rule, in the existing Phase 2 rules, that's not enough. You've got to add some specificity. The minimum control measures say, for example, you've got to control post-construction runoff from sites over an acre. It doesn't say how stringently you have to control it. A permit should be getting to the specifics of how much one has to do, or an MS4 has to do, what is the standard. So has EPA provided a robust enough list of what not to do so that it's clear that advocates can clearly say when a permit is proposed that is too vague, point to these examples and say clearly that does not meet the test. Many of you may have seen those sorts of permit provisions, and highlighting those as well would be very helpful. If EPA, as they've proposed, leaves it to the states to define maximum extent practicable, rather than as we had proposed, defines it with a floor. If that's a limitation in this rule, in what ways can the rule help to promote more rigorous, more effective standards in permits, so that while the rule is framed as a procedural one, ideally, and the entire purpose ought to be that those procedures lead to better permits, right? So one provision to look at here is in the proposed 122.34a. It says each successive permit must meet the requirements of this section based on current water quality conditions, record of BMP effectiveness, and other relevant information. What sort of information should states be evaluating in determining what requirements to impose on the MS4s? The legal standard from the Act, one of the applicable legal standards, is maximum extent practicable. That suggests some comparative notion, right, of something is maximum if it is more than other things, and it is practicable. It needs to be both maximum and practicable, right? And so looking, for example, at what other states have done, if another state has a more stringent standard on something, why would that not be practicable in another state? And if a state were required to look at what the best practices are in permits elsewhere, that could put a burden on the state to either raise itself up to what's been shown to work elsewhere, or have to justify why it can't do so. Similarly, what level of justification should be provided for the selection of control measures that the permitting authority makes? Perhaps there are ways that the rule can focus on some additional rigor in the decision-making process by states that would in turn lead to stronger permits and provide a basis for advocates to make progress in that way. Finally, on option 3, one question EPA has posed is if they allow for this hybrid approach, should the procedural approach, the option 2, be allowed to be used for all aspects of a permit, or should it be limited only to certain aspects of a permit? For example, the water quality-based limitations that I mentioned before. We put forward that proposal earlier. Some states may be looking for flexibility in other ways. Important question for advocates to think about. What do you all think of that? Are there any other pieces of a permit that there should be the opportunity for the permittee, the MS4, to first propose in an NOI and then have the individualized comment, or can everything be handled in a more or less uniform way in the general permit terms themselves? And finally, if to the extent that there is an allowance for the notice of intent and the review of notice of intent for that procedural method, what are the details of the procedures that should accompany that? EPA asked, for example, should the MS4s be allowed to be the ones giving the public notice rather than the states? I would say no. The state is the permitting authority and should be giving that centralized notice. Deborah flagged the question or the issue of what would constitute a revision that needs to go through the process again if an NOI has been approved and BMPs from that NOI incorporated into the permit with respect to that MS4. Suppose the MS4 wants to change its BMPs midstream. What's the process to make sure that that, in turn, does not become self-regulation again? So just in closing, we're going to be continuing to do outreach, NRDC will, with other environmental groups on this. We will be engaged in conversations with other interested parties like the states and regulated municipalities in the hopes of finding some common ground on these issues. And we'll be continuing to do a more detailed analysis of the proposed rule and developing comments for EPA, which we'll be inviting others to join in developing and signing on to. And so if you are interested in joining in that effort, please reach out to Catherine from River Network. And you can also reach out directly to me or Johanna Dyer, my colleague at NRDC, who is working on this rule with me. And that is it.
That's
Thanks
great. That was a lot of information and really in-depth. Thank you so much, Larry. So we've gotten some questions coming in, so this is great. So folks, start thinking about the questions that Larry has put forward to everyone. I mean, there'll be continued conversations, but I know there's probably a lot of questions about the different options. But I will start with one that Sarah wrote in a little while ago, and it has to do with option 1. And how would option 1 permit be specific enough to restore TMDL or 303D listed waters? And how would the public be able to comment on what's required for each 303 or TMDL listed water under option 1, or any of the options, I suppose?
Okay, let me give my answer, which doesn't necessarily reflect agency policy, but I think the way we view general permits is that they can be specific enough to establish requirements without necessarily, nailing every detail. For TMDLs, we require small MS4 permits to have requirements to implement any applicable waste load allocation in a TMDL. And what some states have done is that they have issued, say, a general permit for a particular water body to address a particular TMDL, or they've issued a permit that covers a number of different TMDLs. And so they have specific requirements within the permit itself. And I think that can happen. The other option, of course, would be if we went with option 3, as Larry mentioned. You could, you could detail that more in a separate procedure, but the 303D listing and TMDL process itself has some public participation. The permit just takes what's done and tries to put it in a workable format so that the waste load allocations can be met. And as you know, there's usually a lot of different sources involved with TMDLs. So what the permitting authority needs to do is to focus on what these small MS4s can do in order to meet any waste load allocation. Larry,
got extra additional thoughts on that one?
Yeah, just briefly, as I had said, we think that this circumstance is one where that option 3 of the hybrid really can be useful to provide the opportunity for development of tailored requirements on a MS4 by MS4 basis with respect to each of their waste load allocations in a way that I think would be hard to do, certainly in a single statewide general permit. Deborah mentioned the idea of water body specific general permits, which might correspond, I suppose, to the area that a TMDL addresses, and that's an interesting idea. But in either event, there does need to be a sufficient level of specificity, including compliance schedules that meet the minimum regulatory requirements of the elements of a compliance schedule when there's a TMDL waste load allocation that can't be met immediately, which is almost always going to be the case.
Interesting. Okay. Well, and Sarah, anyone else, type in again if there's further clarification needed on that one. We've gotten some, let me skip around on some of the questions now, because here's a question on definition. Definition of MS4s is less than 100,000 people, but more than how many? That was a question. I think we missed that. And then what is how do we define an urbanized area? So if one of you could help with the definitions with the background, that would be great.
For small MS4s, they serve less than 100,000 people, but they are in urbanized area, and the census defines urbanized area that does have certain population levels and population density. And I'm not sure of those off the top of my head. But I can find out. Yeah, do you know, Larry?
I don't, but I would just add that because population density is a key factor in how the census defines that, there's not a minimum population per municipality that is kind of the lower bound of what counts as a small MS4. A municipality that has a small absolute number of people might be within a contiguous region that has a high enough population density to count as an urbanized area. And I would also add that states are required to identify whether there are other MS4s outside an urbanized area that should also be regulated. So in some instances, additional MS4s have been added to the list in a given state.
Point. And we can put up the link to the definition of MS4 in the chat box in just a sec. So thanks about. Here's a question about sort of process and implementation of this rule. Once it goes into effect, what will happen with the renewal schedules? I know we had some colleagues who were talking to just renew their MS4, and they were hoping that this would, come in before that. So how will that work in terms of phasing in this into permits, upcoming permits, and permit renewals?
It will be phased in. We're not asking states to modify existing permits or reissue permits. We expect that will happen as the permits are reissued. And I did find out the census definition of an urbanized area. And the population density is 2,500, but they also define it to mean 50,000 or more people. So
for the urbanized area, I think, not for the municipal.
For the urbanized area.
Yeah.
And that is, we use that as the target for automatically requiring coverage for small MS4. And there are ways to add others, and others have been added, and there's been a second wave of small MS4s as a result of the new census data. So it is a dynamic universe.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question we've got is, has EPA considered splitting small MS4s, which are very diverse with diverse discharges, into different general permit categories to better meet the spirit of general permits established to group similar entities with similar discharges?
I think that that's a flexibility that exists right now. The category, I don't know, when we thought about what different categories might be appropriate for a general permit, just kind of kicking the idea around, one thought was that maybe MS4s that are newly identified might need different permit terms than an MS4 that has been in existence for 15 years. But certainly there's flexibility now to do that, and I don't see that that would change under the proposed rule.
And Larry, I can't remember, we didn't, in the environmental group comments, we didn't touch on that, did we?
I don't think
I don't remember that coming up.
I mean, general permits themselves can take a lot of different forms, and they are difficult. It's hard to balance the need for specificity with the need for actually getting entities under permit requirements. And that's why we've put out a number of different options, and hopefully we'll get some good public comment on that.
Larry, are you still with us?
Yes.
Oh, good, good. Regarding TMDLs, what about requiring monitoring and iterations of the BMP/stormwater plan to get to the effective practices? San Diego does that on a watershed scale.
That's the under our regulations, that's the prerogative of the permitting authority to determine what monitoring it wants to require. I think in California they have separate watershed plans for that get implemented. So, I probably said enough. Sorry.
Larry, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I would add that it's legally we've taken the position, and I believe it's correct, although EPA has not taken this position, that in a situation where you've got a numeric limit based on a TMDL, that because one of the general principles in the NIPD's permitting regulations is that there needs to be whatever monitoring is needed to determine compliance, that it's impossible to determine compliance without having, in that instance, without having some monitoring to know whether the pollutant load reduction has been achieved. It could be ambient monitoring to see if the water quality standard has been met. It could be end-of-pipe monitoring. Some sort of monitoring, we believe, legally is needed when you've got a numeric limit based on a waste load allocation.
Okay, yeah, so you got the monitoring. Yes, go ahead.
No, as Larry noted, we don't look at it quite that way. We leave that to the discretion of the permitting authority. And the TMDL implementation plan, if there is one, could also have requirements concerning monitoring, and then we would expect to see those in a permit if there's something associated with the TMDL that anticipates a certain type of monitoring.
Okay, so some differences there. Here's a question from Mitch. How will the rule incorporate previous EPA guidance or avoid reliance on future guidance as certain states specifically forbid the state permitting agencies from using or even considering EPA guidance in their stormwater regulation and permits?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. we put out, I mean, guidance by its very nature is non-binding. So the small MS4 regulations have sort of an anomaly in that it does have guidance in the regulation itself. And states, you know, it is guidance. States have the discretion to use it or not, and there's not a lot that our regulations, there's nothing in the regulations that prohibit that.
Right. I mean, I do think this question is getting to how can we make this rule as strong as possible in states where they will only do what's absolutely required, and so trying to make that floor really strong.
Well, I think the language in the proposed rule about clear, specific, and measurable requirements is going to go a long way to get to that end point.
Larry, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I would really focus on that clear, specific, measurable language also, and things that kind of go along with that, and you know, ways, as I suggested before, thinking about ways to elaborate on that in the rule language itself to make sure there's no doubt about what that means. You know, we can say that a permit needs to be sufficiently specific, but what is sufficiently? How do you really frame that in a clear enough way in the regulation that it will be clear to the states, clear to reviewing courts and anyone else what is needed.
I'll just add that we, of course, want to see more specificity, but I think it's also important that a permitting authority have some flexibility in how it addresses certain things so that they can take into account, you know, the particular needs in that part of the country or to meet their own state law requirements. So, you know, it's always a tough balancing act.
And as a follow-up clarification, Mitra said the issue often comes up when EPA offers guidance on what the maximum extent practicable would be. And I think that's, of course, one of the things Larry touched on is trying to figure out ways to make that much clearer.
Yeah, I think as long as EPA decides to issue guidance, it's accepting the fact that it won't be used in all instances. That's the nature of guidance. And, you know, putting out guidance is not a simple matter. So it's difficult even to put out guidance, let alone regulation.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add the obvious point that you know, this exact issue is why you know, why so many in the environmental community put a lot of emphasis on that prior rulemaking effort on post-construction standards, and why we were so disappointed when the agency dropped that, because that was really the best opportunity to avoid this problem of guidance being mere suggestions in terms of how to define MEP. EPA has the authority to actually define it in rules, and we believe that would be the best way for EPA to fulfill its responsibilities to make sure that the Clean Water Act is implemented effectively.
I just want to clarify that EPA has deferred that regulation, not abandoned it.
Oh, is that right? When do you expect it to come back up?
We don't have a time frame.
Are there other questions? We have a few more minutes if people have questions. If not, certainly we can follow up via email, and you have Deborah's and Larry's contact information. Note that Gail has put in a note on the chat box about MS4 size. The 50,000 population is automatic, but any smaller community can be regulated by the state if there's a determination that there is a problem that needs to be addressed. Evaluation of such situations was supposed to be part of the process, but most states got too busy with the ones automatically in because there's so many of them, and also can be petitioned by outside of them.
Right, and petitions can be submitted to regulate any stormwater discharge that's not currently regulated, as Larry knows. So theoretically, there's no floor on that one. But,
right. But also, I think just to be clear, and Deborah, tell me if I misunderstand this, the municipalities that are automatically designated by virtue of being within the urbanized areas, those can be smaller than 50,000 population in the particular municipality, right? So long as that municipality is within the urbanized area.
My understanding is that how the census defines urbanized area includes the 50,000. I'm looking at the.
Yeah, that's right. But within an urbanized area, there might be, say, 10 municipalities that cumulatively comprise the urbanized area, and any one of them might not necessarily exceed the 50,000 population threshold just for that municipality.
I see what you're saying. Often in a situation like that, there will be with general permits, it wouldn't necessarily make a difference, but for the larger MS4s, states have typically issued a permit with a number of different co-permittees so that they can include everyone, all the municipalities that exist within a certain geographical area.
Right. Well, we will be sending a follow-up out to all of our registrants with the recording of this webinar that you can share, and we can also put in a few links to clarify some of the definitions here. So as you continue to think about the small MS4 rule and comments that are due coming up in March, have more of a basis for it. So I think unless there are other questions, we are going to wrap it up. I want to really just thank Deborah and Larry so much for their time today, and thanks everyone for participating. And please note that comments on this rule are due coming up on the proposal in March. As Larry noted, he will be working with his colleagues and others to work with a number of folks, whoever's interested in the environmental community, to develop those comments. So if you're not already on our mailing list to sort of be part of that discussion, please email me and I will add you to that. Because I think the more perspectives, the better. We'll have stronger comments to submit to EPA. And we will send out the recording. And please complete the survey heading your way. We always appreciate feedback. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And we will hopefully see you on another webinar and at River Rally coming up in May. Thank you.